one of the things that I definitely need to address tonight is the historicity of the date today. This is a very solemn and very monumentally disturbing date in American history because we are talking about the day that the first plutonium bomb was ever blown on planet Earth. And this plutonium bomb was blown under extremely desperate circumstances for the United States High Command, and they decided that they were going to take you and your children and all of your children's children and all of your tomorrows and all of their tomorrows down with them. Now, I'll explain that in just a moment, but one of the first things that I would like to address, well, again, before it dribbles out of my ears, is a bit of the phenomena that's going on the Gaza Strip, which of course technically is a portion or is integral to the nation state or the recognized state of Palestine. Now, Palestine, of course, is a very complicated situation, and I've gone into this a bit before, but it won't hurt to go into it again. We do want to remember the fact that the people of Palestine have suffered terribly, and because they have suffered so terribly, we want to maintain that their history is becoming more and more sympathetic to Western ears as essentially the Israeli propaganda of so many years begins to wear off on the Western, shall we say, the Western audience. And as a result, you have far more of a balanced perspective, or at least far more than it used to be, concerning the Israeli and Palestinian situation than you ever did before. So one of the things that we have to remember is, of course, that Palestine is essentially occupied by two separate cultures. One of those cultures is, of course, the Jewish culture, and the other culture is the Arabic culture of the House of Jordan, or the King of Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom. Now, that means that you have an Arab-occupied Palestine and a Israeli-occupied Palestine. Now, I use the term Israeli instead of Jewish, not because I'm trying to give the Jewish people a pass, so to speak, but rather because there is, of course, the concept and the reality of the bloodlines of Semitic Judaism. And that means, of course, when I use that term, that the people of Jewish culture originally hailed from that Middle Eastern land, what Christians know as the Holy Land, and that in terms of their bloodlines, in terms of their genetics, they are really, truly blood brothers and genetically, in a sense, inseparable from the Arabs. There really is no difference between the two ethnically. The difference is, of course, religion and politics. They are all, of course, the products of the family of Abraham. Now, in terms of what we are contending with, what developed was that you had a tremendous expulsion, a series of expulsions, the creation of a diaspora. And a diaspora is, of course, a disseminated or a very diffuse spread of Jewish culture and their ethnicity into various ghettos. And that was a term that was originally developed by the Jews themselves. What we would speak of in Asia and in the Western world, if we were speaking of the nationality of which I am a part of, the Chinese Republic, we would speak of people of my culture as living in Chinatowns all over the world. So the Sinitic, or the Chinese, also the Sino-Viet, because the Vietnamese people are Sinitic, just as the Chinese people are Sinitic, and yet they fight each other all the time. They have a tremendous hatred and disdain for each other. Hopefully those politics can be overcome and a just and lasting peace and cooperation can be reached amongst them. But whoever is antithetical or racist towards the Vietnamese or the Chinese cultures or peoples is essentially anti-Semitic, whether they are talking about either one. Hence the term anti-Semitic applies to the hatred or the persecution of Arabic peoples, just as it does to essentially the Hebraic peoples. So this is why when the peoples of Bosnia or Bosnia-Herzegovina in the 1990s fell into civil or interethnic, internecine conflict, the House of Saud basically appealed to, first they contracted Hill and Knowlton, or H&K, a public relations firm which, as far as I understand, still exists, but the individual who was president at that time sold that company, just like the original individual who owned Blackwater Mercenary Company sold it. But he maintained a kind of consultant relationship. Now, that might be the case with the Hill and Knowlton public relations firm owner, or it may not be. I really don't consciously remember his name at this point, but whoever owned it in the 1990s was one apolitical, amoral, vicious son of a bitch. And I actually have a copy of his book. He wrote a book on how to infiltrate your enemy's camp, meaning just in political campaigns, and sabotage, of course, all of their workings from the inside out, using your own espionage agents to basically sabotage a political campaign. Now, that's exactly what he did during the Bosnian conflict. And when that occurred, he was employed by the House of Saud to expedite their Islamic fundamentalist infiltration and ultimate occupation of the nation of Bosnia, because it had been discovered that Bosnia was replete with oil. It was saturated with oil fields within the ground, and Croatia, of course, dominated the coast, correctly known as Hrvatska. And the Italians had already purchased and set up an enormous amount of oil platforms, or a significant amount of oil platforms, off the coast of Dalmatia, which is an integral part at this point in history of Hrvatska, the state of Croatia, and had in the past, of course, been occupied and incorporated into Italy. Now, with all of this oil politics going on at the time, what happened was the Italians already had what they wanted, had deals ongoing with Croatia, and in terms of Bosnia, it didn't have deals with anybody. So in order to get a control of its oil and ultimately prevent it from going on the market and depleting the value of Saudi oil, the soft underbelly, or the key link in the chain, the weakest link in the chain, was the fact that the European population there had a significant proportion of Muslims. But these were Caucasian European Muslims. As a matter of fact, aside from the Albanians, they were the only distinctively Caucasoid European indigenous native population of Muslims in the continent of Europe. Now, there's a whole story behind that. They were originally members of a Christian heresy known as the Bogomils, who were Slavic and converted to Islam under the Turkish occupation hundreds of years ago to avoid further persecution by both the Christians and the Muslims. They were considered traitors to Christendom in the time of Vladislav Tepes, known of course, in the Western world as Dracula. In his correct Romanian language, he is referenced as Dietrich. Now, he cursed them for their traitorousness and their mass conversion to Islam. He conversed them out loud and orally. Hence, we get the term the curse of Dracula from that. That later on got all warped and convoluted through various regurgitations by Hammer horror films and the like, and which is sad because that helped to distort and hide the reality of the viciousness and the bloodthirstiness of the politics on the ground as they were, which is far more horrific and worse than any British or American or European-produced horror film. So we come on to this point in history where this all links together because the politics of the Balkans is inextricably linked to the politics of the Middle East, specifically the Levantine, which became occupied by the Israelis in two ways. We have the situation in which, more immediately, to conclude that thought or bring it to a closure, the House of Saud, on contraction of Hill and Knowlton, asked them to, of course, bring in that which, at the time, in the very early 90s, was still a very powerful force to be reckoned with in American media, and that was the Jewish lobby. And there was a tremendous nepotism and a domination of American media by many Jewish-related interests, and they were consistently portraying their side of the story whenever it came to the Arab-Israeli conflicts. The most horrifically repugnant example of this would be the entire series of anti-Arabic themed action films that were produced in the 1970s and 80s, as well as action-adventure paperbacks and novels on the mass market. Now, in films like, shall we say, Delta Force, one of the most repugnant that comes to mind, or the Navy SEALs that starred Tom Cruise, one of the original films in that series, we have a situation where the Americans become personally dragged into the Arab-Israeli conflict definitively, if not on the side of the Israelis, then most certainly against the Arabs. Now, in all of these films, one of the first things that you note is that the Arabic people, if you take a look at these films and watch them more than once and just divest yourself detachedly from all of the explosions and all of the action and all of the violence, one of the first things that you notice is the Arabic people have every right, in a sense, to be doing what they're doing, which is basically taking hostages and using them as human shields because they're in a situation where their entire population is, in a sense, being taken hostage and being used as a human shield. And as a result, the Americans get brought in because some members of their own community, the Americans, somehow get caught in the fray. One of their officers gets killed, or one of their own men gets somehow kidnapped or abducted. And so they enter the fray and tear up on Arab ass, and we're all rooting for them in the American theaters and in the American audience. And of course, this entire level of racial hatred that you haven't seen since World War II becomes indoctrinated into American youth and the movie-going public. Now, a lot of this the Americans were prone toward because of their religion. In essence, they were Puritans who had developed a very distinctively transatlantic perspective on the Jewish people that was entirely different from that which had developed over thousands of years on the continent where Christendom originated, which was Europe. Now, of course, in Europe and the Mediterranean, both by the Muslims and the Christians, the Jews had been looked on as, quote-unquote, a necessary evil by those two religious superpowers for centuries, where the Jewish people were the people of the book. In Islam, of course, Muhammad had established anti-usury laws, which prevented the establishment of banks for well over 1,000 years. And in Christendom, of course, money was deemed the root of all evil, and therefore it was best not to touch it, not to work in such professions as accounting, which was considered a vile and disreputable pursuit. Loan sharking, etc., usury was permitted, but no good Christian would do that to another. So all of these responsibilities were left to the Jewish populations in their ghettos, which wound up, of course, having an enormous domination or manipulation, both of the economic currencies exchange, the various economic activities across the Mediterranean. So we have a situation where, because of this, the Jewish people themselves became perceived as manipulators, as money grubbers, and, of course, basically the devil's spawn, the literal seed of Satan in many ways, viewed as basically as the descendants of Cain by more extremist elements of Christianity, and in a like perspective in Islam. So this is what led to pogroms throughout the Jewish Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe. This is what led to, ultimately, genocide and, of course, the Holocaust. Now, in the case of all of this, you have a situation where it has been argued quite compellingly, and it is an argument accepted by myself, that the irony of all of this is that the great deal of European Jewry, population of Jews in Europe, was not Semitic. That the majority of the Semitic diaspora had taken off to the four corners of the earth to literally settle in places like Mizoram in India, which is spelled Mizoram. And Mizoram in India is a Jewish state that is within it is autonomous, or rather semi-autonomous, within the nation state or confederation, if you will, of India, which is in many real senses a very artificial nation. It is a nation that some, including myself in some respects, would argue really should not exist. I am not in any way, shape, or form advocating a foreign Raj as had existed under the British, but what that created under the British forced, very genocidal, very offensive and abusive and exploitive union that or occupation, what that created was a semi-singular entity that does not function well at all. Now, at the tail end of that entity, there is a choke point that leads between India and what is now the nation of Bangladesh, what was once, if I remember correctly, East Pakistan. And they fought for their independence. They gained that independence from West Pakistan, or what is today simply Pakistan, and the nation of Bangladesh now, of course, is this horrible hellhole of third worldly or fourth worldly quality of life or lack thereof, and it is a nation that essentially bifurcates or divides certain what should be independent nation states from the rest of India. Now, India, of course, has what they call the chicken neck, or this choke point that leads between India and Bangladesh to these 7 states that are semi-autonomous by the simple fact that it's very difficult for India to administer them. One of them is this nation that is right between, bordering as a buffer state, effectively, India, or extreme India, outer India, and Burma, or Myanmar, as it is known today. And that nation is Mizoram, or what should rightly be a nation. Now, that contains people who are very interbred with, of course, the indigenous populations. They are now ethnically fairly indistinct from their regional population base, but they are essentially Jews, and their religion is Jewry. Now, there was another case, of course, of the Jewish people in South Africa or Zimbabwe, and this population was ultimately genetically proven, despite the fact that they have enough melanin on their exterior to deem them black or African. They were proven to be Jewish in descent. So as a result, much of the Semitic population, the original Semitic population, bred out of existence. There is, of course, a very different kind of Jewry in terms of the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi. Now, in terms of the Ashkenazi Jews, if I remember correctly from the Kostler thesis, they were, of course, actually the genetic descendants of the Khazar, who were a Turkic tribe that converted to Judaism at a period of time when the religion of Judaism was a proselytizing religion, a campaigning religion, in the same way that the Christians were crusading, in the same manner in which the Muslims were jihadi. And as a result, a very powerful tribe of Turkic warrior peoples converted to Judaism and established a slave-based empire throughout the Caucasus and Caspian Sea region. Now, the Khazar Empire was extremely influential for hundreds of years, and when it broke apart, then many of its refugees dissimulated into Europe, where they ultimately were the descendants of those who established and later on populated the Jewish ghettos of Europe, primarily in the East or throughout the East. Now, this, of course, is what led to the concept of the Asiatic Jew in Europe. Now, as a result, of course, these Turkic peoples, when they were expelled by violence of the Holocaust into Israel, those that survived the genocide in Europe formed and established the state of Israel. Now, it is well known amongst the elite of Israel, the founding fathers, the Zionists, the original people who established that state. It is known to them that this is the case, that they are racially distinct from the surrounding Palestinian population. Therefore, their expulsion, their ethnic cleansing of the Arabic peoples was indeed truly a racial war. This is what most people do not understand. Everything that I have just articulated concerning the brotherhood racially of the Semitic peoples, whether Jewish or Arabic, has just been deconstructed by what I'm articulating now. Because the Semitic peoples, which formed the Sephardim, or the very religious Jews, many of which, say for instance, were the descendants of people like Sassoon, of Vidal Sassoon fame, and the Sassoons who established the Shanghai Stock Exchange. These people were, of course, Semitic. But the other Jews that came and predominantly populated originally the state of Israel, as well as those that are coming from Russia today, these are people of a Turkic extraction descended from the Hazars of the warrior tribe of the empire that surrounded the Caspian Sea. Now, all of this, of course, is denied vehemently by many people in Jewish academia. And they're wrong. Because the people who established and founded the state of Israel very much operated on this assumption and viewed the people of Palestine as an inferior Semitic race. And they were, therefore, an anti-Semitic culture that established itself on the Levantine and ultimately allied with Turkey, or the Republic of Turkey. This is why you had a Turkish and Israeli alliance that has been on and off for decades and has particularly become stronger and stronger over the past few decades with some notable bumps in the road. There's been some severances and some reestablishments of the alliance, however unofficial, of Turkey and Israel, mostly on the basis of water politics and the incredible vulnerability that everyone in the Middle East and Southwest Asia suffers from the scarcity and the need to distribute, for purposes of survival, the liquid gold, the nectar of sweet water. Now, the Turks, of course, have created an enormous advantage for themselves strategically by the construction of several dams by which they can control the flow of water into the Levantine. And as a result, they can literally dry up nations in the Levantine, so they are in the strategic high ground. And as a result, the Israelis have wisely and for practical purposes, pragmatically, cultivated a strategic relationship with Turkey so that if the two ever find themselves in war with the Arabs, who are ethnically different from both nations, Turkey and Israel, are essentially of the same stock genetically. And they are involved in an apartheid and in a race war with the Arabic peoples and the Kurds for the Turks. And by damming up the water where it sources from the Euphrates, from the Tigris, from the rivers that source from the Turkish Republic, whenever a true all-out conflict erupts, the Turks can simply turn off the tap. And everyone down below in the south will dry up except for their Turkish relations, their genetic brothers, who occupy the apartheid state of Israel. So this is a true apartheid state. This truly is a South Africa of the Levantine. You have a Turkish elite establishing a Jewish religious state in the nation state of Israel that has an apartheid policy against an entirely different ethnic group. The Semitic peoples are the Palestinians, the indigenous peoples down below them. And as far as they're concerned, the Semitic peoples down below them are as inferior a race as the blacks were to the whites of South Africa. Now, this is not anti-Semitic propaganda. This is just reality of the situation. I am the first person who has always stated that the worst thing to happen to South Africa, unfortunately, despite the idealism of the anti-apartheid movement, what has happened with the elimination of apartheid has been the disintegration of the quality of life for both blacks and whites in the former nation state or Republic of South Africa. And I say the former Republic of South Africa because you cannot even really call the South Africa of today a functioning republic. It is a balkanized state of disrepair, a state of decay, a state of civil war, ethnic and internecine and racial conflict, which is exactly what Israel would disintegrate into were they to eliminate their apartheid. That is the tragedy of these minority governments, is that they create an economic situation that is entirely inviable without their apartheid programs or their shall we say, their system, their racial division system. In fact, the quality of life for the people underneath them is as much based on it as the quality of life for the elites. And it disintegrates for everybody when that kind of system becomes dismantled. Now, this is a situation that, of course, is reprehensible by definition, but at the same time is something that could become much worse. So it is only on that level that I tend to argue for the maintenance of the state of Israel. Also, as well, Jewish culture would indeed die out with the demise of the state of Israel. The differences genetically aside from the majority of the population in the state of Israel and the population of the diaspora is that we have a situation where about over half, a little over 50%, or maybe 60% of the Jewish population in the world exists in Israel. So if that demise were to occur and all of those people were to be driven into the sea, even if the majority of them, which would be impossible, managed to escape, practically impossible for the situation as we understand it today. Things could change in the future, but in terms of, as far as we understand the situation right now, in terms of logistics and possible, any potential for evacuation, or mass evacuation at least, even if the majority of them escape, which would be untenable right now, contemporarily, they would probably quickly breed out into an unrecognizable series of ghettos worldwide, and Judaism, as we understand it or perceive it, would cease to exist. So for that case, we have a situation where, again, I opt or advocate maintenance, for now at least, of the status quo for the foreseeable future. And for that reason, I am always alarmed, of course, whenever any of these incidents flare up into a potential conflict in places like the Gaza Strip. So hopefully I've put some perspective behind that. I'm going to contextualize that a bit further, and I'm getting some reinforcement facts from my secretarial assistant concerning the population of the Jewish people, which is only basically 1% of the world's population is Jewish. And of that, we've got probably around 14 million people. It's not even 1%. Yes, that's quite true. It's less than 1% of, or just under 1% of the population of the world is identifies themselves as Jews, which is deemed both a race and a religion. Now, in terms of that 1%, they constitute about 14 million peoples. And so, since half of them, or a little over half of them, live in the state of Israel, yes, were that to disappear, the Jewish people themselves would quickly disappear along with it. So, in a sense, that makes me, because there's 7 million people in Israel at this point, that makes me, on the basis of what I'm saying, essentially a pro-Zionist. So I am a pro-Zionist for that reason, because to be antithetical to it would be genocidal. Now, I'm not going to use the word anti-Semitic, because I've just clarified the fact that we are speaking about a elitist minority that occupies that strip of land in the Levantine that is not even Semitic. So understand that it is a race war, that you have two entirely different races that are pitted against each other, and that one part of that conflict, the Israeli part, dragged you, an American, your economy, your culture, into their fight for decades. And one way that they did that was through Golden Globus, that Israeli mafia that produced cinematic trash like Delta Force, where you were made to root for the destruction of a Palestinian population that was genuinely Semitic. So that is part of the insanity of the American situation. Now, the other half of occupied Palestine is, of course, that which is occupied by the Arab. They are Semitic as well as the people that they occupy. So in the case of Jordan, occupied Palestine is all Arabic, only it's of different families or different clans. The Hashimi, or the Hashemites of the kingdom of His Highness the King of Jordan, they're a princely Arab family. They are direct descent from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and their direct descendant at this point in history is King Hussein. Now, King Hussein is, of course, indirectly related to Saddam Hussein. Now, they were of different clans, but they are of the same tribe. King Hussein is, of course, the 42nd generation direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. Again, just to be correct about his name, we say peace be upon him at the end of his name. Now, I am not Islamic, but I do my best to respect other cultures. Now, the roots of the Hashemite family stretch back not only to the Prophet Muhammad, but to the Prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael. So Jordan essentially is occupied by this family because this family originally did not live there. They were originally the rulers of Iraq. That is why their distant relative was Saddam Hussein, who was somebody who was of a branch of that ancient family tree. So in terms of the different clans that they were a part of, again, King of Jordan is descendants of the ancient Banu Hashim, or the clan of Hashim. And I could go into the details of that for hours. I don't think the majority of you would be interested. But originally as well, their clan, which has a very checkered and violent history and is actually the proponent of a very liberal and progressive form of Islam, they were not only the rulers of Iraq, they were the rulers of the entire Fertile Crescent, meaning Syria and Iraq, what was then known as Iraq. And under King Hussein, they also lost their rule of East Jerusalem, as it's said in the Hebraic, Jerusalem, in the 1967 Six-Day War, just the year after I was born, in 1966. Now, Jordan, of course, today is ruled by King Abdullah II, if I remember correctly. He succeeded King Hussein in 1999, when Hussein, who had lost East Jerusalem, a chain smoker, by the way, died of cancer. Now, in terms of what they also ruled, most importantly, they were originally the gardens of the most holy sites of Islam, Al-Makkah and Al-Madinah, what the West knows as Mecca and Medina. So, in terms of their situation, they had it all, and they lost it, not through corruption, not through incompetence, but through British and American manipulation and insurgency, which basically took, as the British do originally, it was the Brits who pioneered all of this, the Brits entered the Arabian Peninsula, or Felix Arabia, and they found the most lazy, good-for-nothing, worthless tribe of camel-humping jackasses you could find. People who were so corrupt, nobody would deal with them. People who would basically kill their own mothers to save up on camel dung for the fire at night when it gets cold in the desert. And, of course, these were the people that the rest of everyone else on the peninsula spat upon as the Saudis. And so the Brits said, well, we'll take these people who nobody likes, put them in charge, and when we get them in charge, since everybody hates them, they'll be totally dependent on us for their very existence. And they financed them, gave them machine guns, gave them air support, and they drove out the house of Hashim into the desert and installed as the rulers and protectors of Al-Makkah and Al-Medina these irate camel jockeys, who now, of course, dominate the world. And they dominate the world due to your horrible communist president, the socialist Roosevelt, who bought them out from under the Brits. And, of course, these low-down camel humpers from out of the sands, when Roosevelt, of course, had given away all of America's known supply of petroleum, all of its known reserves in World War II in an orgasm of largesse to the Soviet Union, to the British Empire, which had 1 billion people to support in India alone, when he gave it to China, which had 1 billion people in its warring nation in the midst of a civil war, when he gave it, of course, to the French and the Dutch empires whose oil-bearing colonies were stolen in the Dutch East Indies, or so they claimed. They were simply liberated by the Japanese because they had been stolen by the Dutch from the native population. Okay, because nobody had any oil left except the United States amongst the wretched allies. Roosevelt gave it all away. 95% of our known reserves. Billions and billions, tens of billions of barrels of oil. Every single drop floating these empires on American largesse for free through Lend-Lease. And no peace be upon him. God rot his bones, Roosevelt in hell. And that individual, of course, went to the Great Bitter Lake between the locks of the Suez Canal, met up with the King of the House of Saud to buy him out from under the Brits. And, of course, the House of Saud, the King Fahd of the House of Saud, King Saud of the House of Saud, Fahd was his descendant, his heir. King Saud of the House of Saud knew he had Roosevelt by the balls and the short and curlies and by it all, so he yanked him by the dick when he stepped onto his flagship. And that was the Quincy. And that had been converted to hold Roosevelt's wheelchair through an elevator that was built into the smokestack. And, of course, he should have been incinerated if there were any justice in the world, and hopefully he's being incinerated now. But at any rate, he was brought up onto the deck where, of course, the King of the House of Saud, as I've stated multiple times, and this is photographed, and the photographs are in the National Archives. You can find them if you research them. At any rate, the King of the House of Saud brought on a whole flock of sheep onto the deck of the USS Quincy, and, of course, informed Roosevelt that these sheep were for his men to screw. So that they wouldn't defile any of the pure Muslim women on the Arabia Felix, of the Arabian Peninsula. Roosevelt, of course, went for it, had his men bow down. This is literal. You can see it in photographs. Had his men bow down and kneel before the King of the House of Saud. And since that time, you have lost your sovereignty to the House of Saud, because he took the dollar and nailed it to the outflow of Saudi oil, which created the petrobug, which Nixon attempted to take us off, indeed did take us off of, though no one functionally acknowledges that. And he removed us from the Bretton Woods monetary system, which had us nailed to the House of Saud. And its petrobug, its outflow of Saudi oil, they struck back, of course, with an oil embargo, which destroyed the Nixon administration. And tragically, during that period of time, that is when Kissinger took over. He was functionally running America's empire and its foreign policy in totality, while Nixon was dealing with the horrors of the Watergate scandal. And as a result, Kissinger, an ardent Zionist, was ultimately given the highest award of Israel, their highest medal, for all that he did for Israel. And this is a fact, by the way. You can look that up. Kissinger, of course, basically directed us to total support, the United States, to total support of the nation state of Israel, which otherwise would not exist today because they were going to lose that war in 1973. The Yom Kippur conflict, what is known as the Ramadan conflict in the Arab world. And the Americans, of course, know it by the Jewish name, the Yom Kippur conflict. The rest of the world knows it, by the way, as the Oktober, or the Arabic word for October, the October conflict, taking place during my birthday month of 1973, in which we basically were the only nation on earth, Europe, Asia, Africa, the rest of the world supported the Arab peoples, but the United States pumped everything into Israel, and it survives to this day. Now, because of that, of course, to the rest of the world, America is Jewmerica. They don't see stars on that flag. They see shields of David. And that is what the rest of the world sees, is 50 shields of David, or stars of David, as the Americans know it. In their ignorance, it's not a star, it's a shield. But that is what everyone else sees on the blue field of that banner of stars and stripes. So the rest of the world sees shields and stripes since the ardent Zionist Kissinger led us down that path. And, of course, during the Syria conflict back on September 11th of last year, Kerry, the Democrat, met with Kissinger, the Republican, and Kissinger and Kerry, even though Kissinger is supposedly retired, were trying to drum up a war from the American public against, of course, the President Bashar of Syria. And the American public wouldn't go for it. I mean, literally, these people wanted to start a war on September 11th, which also happens to be the birthday of the president of Syria, Bashar. And when the Americans said no, this was a great situation of what if everybody gave a war and nobody came. Now, Bashar, the reason they hate him so much is he is a member of the Ba'athist Party, which is the Arab Socialist Fascist Party that was, of course, that which Saddam Hussein was a member of. So there is this enormous connection of blood and politics that the House of Saud and their bitch, the United States, their lackey, their running dogs, their mercenary nation of infidels, is trying to dismantle. All of your foreign policy is based on the whims and the needs and the desires of the House of Saud. Now, this is incredibly ironic considering the fact that it used to be based on that of Israel. Those days are over. So as a result, the House of Saud, along with Israel, pretty much equally dominate American foreign policy. Whatever happens in the world happens because of this axis of evil, Israel, the House of Saud, and the United States. So what is it that is happening right now is of course, further attack on the people of Palestine. Now, the people of Palestine, of course, suffered their version of the Holocaust, known as Al-Nakba, as was perpetrated by the Jewish people, or the Israelis. They're actually Turkish genetically. They're racially Turkic, and they're religiously Jewish. But that doesn't really apply because the founding fathers of the State of Israel were overwhelmingly, and still are today, overwhelmingly atheistic socialists. So there is no true religious state of Israel. There is a tolerance for religious Jews who come to visit on a religious pilgrimage the Wailing Wall, very similar to the Muslim peoples who visit Al-Makkah and Al-Madinah. Now, many Jewish people will come and serve in the military of Israel from all over the world for a period of time, and this is so they can earn their Israeli citizenship. So there is a lot of complication, but in general, the baseline population of the nation-state of Israel is not at all religiously or ethnically Jewish. They're not religious. They don't practice that Hebraic religion that was originally that old-time religion of the God of Abraham and their seed father, their seed line, progenitor. They don't follow shall we say, that they're not of the same gene stock or bloodline of the Semitic peoples, because they're Turkic and descendant of the children of Hazar and that empire that once surrounded the Caspian. By the way, that's spelled Khazar for anyone who wants to look it up. Khazar. Now, the Hazars, of course, by the way, the Arthur Koestler book, which spoke of this, was titled The 13th Tribe. And the 13th Tribe is a pioneering work in what the mainline Jewish academia will insist in is fiction. Okay, none of that, their claim, could be further from the truth. Arthur Koestler was deeply respected. This is not fringe. This is not some white supremacist kind of Anglo-Israelite kind of, shall we say, spurious scholarship. It's not a spurious work of scholarship. Everything he is saying in there is, in essence, true. So we have a situation where the Israelis are neither religiously nor ethnically Jewish. They truly are a foreign state of occupation. Nevertheless, at this point in history, maintain the status quo for all of the reasons I've just articulated. Now, again, before I overdwell on that or become overly repetitious or redundant, we are stuck in this situation now, and we're asking ourselves, okay, what about the mandate of Palestine that got divided? And you had the nation of Jordan, which is now the, shall we say, exile point or the last redoubt for the Hashemite kingdom. Okay, well, what we need to do as a planet, as all of the cultures of the earth, we need to unite in the expulsion of the House of Saud from the Arabian Peninsula, certainly from their maintenance of the Hajj, and we need to reinstall the Hashemite dynasty. So we'll speak again. We'll be right back. It's bottom of the hour right now, so let me finish up my thoughts as to what is going on in the Levantine. And basically what happened was on December 7th, Pearl Harbor Memorial Day in 2012. Let me see, that was about 2 years ago. Chief Operating Officer David Stover of Noble. And Noble is, of course, a Houston, Texas-based Energy Incorporated kind of firm. They basically are specialists in looking for gas fields. Of course, that's why they're in Houston, Texas. And, of course, they've got more of their share of it, which is destroying the Gulf functionally forever right now, seeping out thanks to British Energy Petroleum Company, or British Petroleum Energy, BP, just call them bastards, and you've got it down. At any rate, Texas-based Noble Energy Incorporated discovered the Tamar oil fields circa 2009. They so christened it in honor of the ancient ancestress of much of the Yehudah, or the Yehudah Shvet, the tribe of Judah, literally the family of praise. And these are the people from whence Bet David, or the House of David in particular, sourced from. And the story of Tamar is embedded in the ancestor narratives of Genesis. So basically, you can find out more about it by looking up things such as the Jewish Woman's Archive. At any rate, fascinating story, and Tamar was utilized to name this field. Now, this is obviously a very pro-Hebraic approach to a gas field which seeps all over the Levantine, specifically the seafloor of the Levantine off the coast of Israel, but also through the Gaza Strip off the coast of Palestine. Palestine, by the way, being the ancient name, or rather a bastardization of the ancient name Philistine. So this is a Judaic-Philistine conflict, and the reason that the Balkans factors in, of course, is due to the fact that during the Second World War, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem approached the Third Reich for help and support in the creation of an independent fascist Palestine. And such a Palestine would have taken up all of what is today both Jordan and Israel. Now, Adolf Hitler agreed to help support the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and it is through this agreement that we had the formation of the Schutzstaffel, Handschar Division, and various other Bosnian Muslim divisions under Heinrich Himmler. And these Waffen-SS divisions served murderously, effectively, against the genocide of Sephardim Jews in the Balkans. Handschar is a kind of a Bosniak word or a Bosanski term, a Srpski language or Croatian, Hrvatski language term for slit the throat. And that is exactly what they did to many captured Sephardim Jewish civilians. They also served admirably well in an operational sense, tactically against the Hellenic or Orthodox Byzantine insurgency of the Greeks into Macedonia. And they were essentially exterminating both the Jews and serving as a suppression counterinsurgency force against the Greeks in what is today the independent state of Macedonia, or the former Republic of Macedonia, as it is known in some circles, because the Greeks don't want people referring to it as Macedonia, else they fear that their own Macedonia or Macedonia will secede and join to form a greater Macedonia with the Slavic Macedonians in the north. Complicated Balkan politics. Part of this complicated Balkan politics was, of course, that at the time that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem met Adolf Hitler, he tried to convert him to Islam. And Hitler said, thank you, but no, I am not interested in conversion to the warrior religion of Islam, but I do respect it as a warrior cult of the moon god, the sword god of Allah. And because of that, of course, you have my wholehearted support. And this, of course, provided Adolf Hitler an ultimate support by the Islamic community in his escape from Europe after the ceasefire on the European continent. Now, it is important to remember that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was, for all intents and purposes, ethnically Aryan. He was blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and guess what? He was European. Makes sense, right? He was Caucasian. He was a Bosnian Muslim. This is why when he came back to mobilize the Philistines, as the Jewish people viewed them, the Palestinians, he mobilized them under the banner of white supremacist Islam, very similar to black supremacist Islam, a cultic milieu that is schismatic and separate from either Shia or Sunni Islam, which are Persian or Arabic in nature. In terms of the Albanian or Shqiptiri Islam, that is far more of a nationalism, very similar because they were occupied by the Turks, very similar to Turkic Islam, which is the most secular and the most progressive of all of the forms of Islam in general. Of course, the most secular and progressive of them all are the Kurds, which is, of course, why the Turks and the Arabs and the Persians all unite to annihilate and exterminate the Kurds whenever they can. And the Kurds have the great misfortune of living in the center of it all. Now, in terms of the politics of Palestine, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Aryan, European, Caucasian, Bosnian Muslim, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, is the man who came back to Palestine and helped to mobilize the Palestinians against the invading Turkic, atheistic, socialist Jews, quote unquote. They were neither religiously nor racially Jews. And as a result, the entire politics of the Levantine today are based on the wartime politics of the Balkans stretching back to the time of the Third Reich. Now, do things begin to make sense? No, because everything is the opposite of what you were taught. You were taught that Semitic Jews had come to resettle in the Holy Land after their expulsion millennia ago, and they were reclaiming that which was their birthright through the covenant of God, and that the evil Arabic peoples were staunching them in this righteous attempt to resettle in the promised land. and that all of the Arabs were supported, of course, by Nazi exiles, but none of this was presented in the light which I am presenting it to you now. The Third Reich, of course, fulfills the role of the liberators and the supporters of a victim population of ethnic genocide. Because just as the Jewish people refer to the Holocaust as Hashoah, or the catastrophe, so too do the Palestinians refer to the millions of people who died when the Jewish people occupied the Levantine, and to the millions more that were expulsed and forced to resettle in Jordan and under Hashemite rule of a foreign dynasty which itself had been expulsed through the Brits and their insurgency of the Arabian Peninsula, and how they lost Jerusalem, they lost, of course, Syria, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula itself, and most importantly, their guardianship over the Al-Naqqa and Al-Madinah, the most holy sites of Islam. All of them were forced to exile themselves to a rulership over an exile population in what is today Jordan, or, more accurately, Hashemite-occupied Palestine. So you have a situation where the Semitic people in Palestine are under a rulership of foreign Arabs who themselves have been exiled, much as my native National Republic of China was exiled to Taiwan, into this barren strip of desert called Jordan. And you have, of course, the people of Israel who are neither ethnically nor religiously Jewish, but ethnically Turkish, and in terms of their politics, atheistic and socialist. And the Nationalsozialistisch of the Third Reich were supporting the native indigenous population against this alien invader white settler regime of Turks. Now, do things begin to look like they make some sense? Well, obviously, the Zionists were also supported by Fascist Italia and the Third Reich because they were the only Jews who wanted to leave Europe. And as a result, got an enormous amount of training in armored warfare from the likes of Rommel and Guderian, got training in agriculture. Remember, there were no Jewish farmers. There were no Jewish farmers. They were doctors. They were lawyers. They were accountants. Maybe some of them worked the land in the Eastern Pale of Settlement, but damn few. And the reality was they were hated, loathed, and despised for dominating the economy of the Jewish Pale of Settlement throughout their empire, and it was nothing less than an empire in Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europeans were gleeful to exterminate them, and the Third Reich couldn't have done it without popular support. So as a result, all of this conspired to expulse a 7th million people, if you will, survivors of the Holocaust, which actually took, of course, 12 million people, as I continually present, and it basically exiled them to the nation-state of Israel, where they invaded and they settled down. But at that point, it was not the Zionists being supported by the Nazis. It was the Zionists being supported by the communists under Stalin, and then eventually by the Americans under Kissinger. You heard me right, not under Nixon, under Kissinger, who effectively ran the country to the ground and ran its foreign politics directly into Israeli advantage, like an Israel, that tiny little strip of land filled with, at that time, only about 1 million people, was like a minnow dragging a whale in its wake. It dragged the United States into the fray and ultimately established itself as functionally the 51st state of the United States. All of this is backfiring now, and with the enormous amount of Russian emigres into Israel, 1/3 of the population of Israel, of course, its Umgangssprache is Russian. Its native language is Russian, and they vote as a voting bloc, pro-Russian, so they are becoming more and more economically and politically aligned to Vladimir Putin's Russia. So you have all of these complicated politics of a functionally fascist apartheid state in Israel of a separate race and no religion at all, occupying a strip of land, exiling a native population. They refer to the exile that they suffered, the Palestinians do, as al-Nakba, or guess what? The catastrophe. Exactly the same word in Arabic that the Jewish people use for Hashoah. the word meaning the catastrophe, referring to the Holocaust in the Hebraic language. So there you have it. That is some of the complication of the politics that we are contending with in that part of the world. Now, to complicate all of that, of course, you had a Texas corporation, Noble Energy, finding this gas field that was estimated at approximating, excuse me, my voice is drying up again. It's approximating 9 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Now, I hope you appreciate the magnitude of what I've just exposed. 9 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Now, quite tellingly, Noble Energy chose to issue public statement about 12 days later, towards Christmas, on December 19th of 2012, and that was over 2 years prior to Texas headquartered Noble Energy delivering the Tamar Pearl Harbor December 7th advisory on striking it big in gas. Noble Incorporated had already discovered Leviathan back in 2010. That's the largest gas field in the eastern Mediterranean. It stretches from Al-Syria Akbar. By the way, the president of Syria, his first name is Bashar. I keep calling him by his first name. His last name is al-Assad. So President Assad is how you will hear him referred to in American media. I think of him almost at this point like for lack of a better word, like a buddy. So I think of him as Bashar. His full name is Bashar al-Assad. Well, guess what? He's got more oil now than Kuwait or Qatar can produce because he's got this enormous gas field. His problem will be ever being able to assess it with the war that he's contending with that was started by the United States and their Blackwater and Central Intelligence Agency sponsored insurgencies. And Israeli-sponsored insurgencies as well, all aimed to keep him off the market so that he doesn't threaten the oil output of the House of Saud. Now, this Leviathan stretches from the coast of Syria all the way down through Egypt. And this was the reason for Arab Spring being launched in Egypt to take away its ability to take advantage of Leviathan, an enormous gas field. Both finds, of course, lie off collaterally the land of Israel, the coast of Israel, and they also lie off Palestinian waters by virtue of the Gaza Strip. Now, a little more on Leviathan. The natural gas reserves are estimated as something in the range between 20 trillion to 25 trillion cubic feet. So we're talking about an enormous amount of gas that could make any nation accessing it the next Kuwait, the next Qatar, the next House of Saud, in a sense. So some experts are estimating there might be up to 600 million barrels of petrol or oil. Oil drilling, of course, is a multi-corporation endeavor. Noble Incorporated operates the well on 70% working interest. Dalek Drilling Limited Partnership and Avner Oil Exploration Limited Partnership each hold about 15% at stake. Nor is that all. In late 2010, huge natural gas deposits off Syria's Mediterranean shores were discovered. The initial results revealed that the entire eastern Mediterranean is swimming in huge untapped oil and gas reserves. Preliminary exploration has confirmed similarly impressive reserves of oil and gases in the waters off Turkeyland, or Turkey, the republic thereof, and of course, the democracy of Cyprus, Kypriaki Demokratia. And, of course, we have the Elleniki Demokratia Iliadia, the Hellenic democracy of Greece, has the potential for becoming wealthy. This is why they crashed its economy, people. This is why they destroyed its banking system, bought out its banks, and sank its economy to the ground. All of this threatens to take the House of Saud off the political map. And, of course, Israel wants to dominate it all in the Levantine. So, in terms of Greece and Cyprus, these are historically reviled by the degenerate American empire because these are the true birthplaces of democracy, while the United States is constitutionally an imperial republic that mass deludes itself as promoting democracy worldwide by force of arms. And per Imperial Republican U.S. Geological Survey records, the Levant Basin, a triangular slice of the Mediterranean lying between Cyprus, or Cyprus, and Eretz Israel Hashlema, the greater state of Israel, it contains an estimated 122 trillion cubic feet of gas and well over 1.5 billion barrels of petrol, or oil, as it's known in the English of the president, as opposed to the English of the king. So the above-cited Levant Basin that I've just articulated is inclusive in coverage of the divided island state of Cyprus, the coastal state of Israel, and Lebanon, or Lebanon, and, of course, Dalouet, Palestine, or the state of Palestine, via its Gaza Strip, the last coastal state so entangled, having been proclaimed on November 15th of 1988 by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which unilaterally, of course, adopted the Palestinian People's Declaration of Independence. Said document claimant of territories as defined according to borders that were drawn in 1967 and designatory of Yerushalayim, or Jerusalem, as its capital. The areas constituting the state of Palestine have since been occupied by Israel in aftermath of the Six-Day War, the third Arab-Israeli conflict of June in 1967, with Palestinian police authority exercising limited internal administration of socio-political affairs since 1993. In consequence, of course, the Israeli government plans to construct a floating liquefied natural gas terminal with a sea-based defense radar, which of course is an acronym for radio detection and ranging system, off of its Mediterranean coast, even while expanding its extant naval force to protect that which it claims as its own rich offshore gas fields. Now, however, in contradiction to this intent, the state of Syria, the Lebanese Republic, also possess Levant Basin oil and gas rights by which to explore their own respective economic zones, which are exclusive. And these sea zones, of course, per the United Nations, extend towards the horizon out to over 200 nautical miles. And per the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, that would make, of course, Palestine and Syria very rich nations. And this is why Lebanon's parliament speaker, Nabi Berri, he basically stated that Israel is ignoring the deposits which extend into Lebanese waters and slant drilling all of Lebanese oil as if it were Israeli oil. So that is what is leading to the rebellion and the conflicts against Israeli theft of all the economic future prosperity that Palestine would otherwise have. And it was just such a maritime seabed energy resources disputation which prompted Israel into attacking Palestine and seizing Palestinian lands, precepts to denying the Palestinian peoples their oil and gas rights in the Levant Basin. This is why they dispatch Mossad, which, by the way, literally transliterates from the Hebrew into the Institute. Americans talk about the agency when they refer to the CIA. Israelis talk about the Institute when they refer to Mossad. Now, they were employed, of course, in contracting foreign mercenaries and, along with the United States, in the instigation of a bloody uprising as a rationale by which to frack from Al-Syria its oil and gas rights in the Levant Basin. So the emergence of Leviathan has been casual of enormous economically driven geopolitical consequences and subsequent political destabilizations. The gas field of Leviathan is the reason why the U.S. again orchestrated the political uprising in Egypt and the fiscal coup in Elaz, or Greece. And American mercenaries and Mossad intelligence have dispatched killing squads into Syria as well as Palestine. This is all symptomatic of energy economics in the end days of Western civilization. Now, how am I going to close this? One of the things that I brought up in the past is, of course, the neutron bomb. We might have to carry this into next Topical Tuesday or into my next exposition on a Saturday with open lines, because we've got very little time left. But I've spoken of Israel being the only nation in the world that was possessed of neutron bombs to stop incoming nuclear attacks on the state of Israel. And in terms of that situation, a neutron burst, which is essentially a dirty bomb that releases an enormous amount of radioactivity, would scramble the brains of electronic homing devices that guide or navigate any incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles or medium-range ballistic missiles on the part of Israel in its conflicts with anyone from the House of Saud, potentially, to Iran, to anyone in area, including Egypt, including Turkey. Whoever would attack Israel, the neutron bombs would be their defense against those radioactive bombs hitting Israel. We'll go into the end result of what might happen as a result of that, how that factors into the Great Wall of Israel. Anyhow, well, we'll see you on Saturday Night Firing Lines. We'll discuss more of this and again on Topical Tuesday. And thank you for bearing with me on an analysis of ongoing politics in the Levantine. Very much necessary in light of what's going on.